Hello and welcome to Spinning a Yarn with Idle Hands. Today I am going to be making a stingray using Big Twist Posh yarn and a 5 millimeter hook. I got this yarn at Joann, and since Joann has closed and Michaels has taken over the Big Twist Posh line, I find that I can't find as many of the former colors that Joann used to have, so I'm not sure if I could find this color again if I wanted to. But they do still have a lot of great colors and they're coming out with new colors all the time. You also may notice that I am using a 5 millimeter hook and Big Twist calls for an 8 millimeter hook. If you are new to making amigurumi, that is one thing that I would offer as advice is to make sure you size down your hook. The hooks that are recommended are more for a looser stitch. When you are doing amigurumi, you want to make sure that you close those tiny gaps so when you stuff them, there's no stuffing showing. So because this is a simple back and forth process for this particular plush, I am making a simple slip stitch as opposed to a magic circle. And I will just go back and forth increasing at the end of each row to create that V shape that you think of when you think of a sort of standard giant stingray. So as I'm sitting here crocheting this, I am recalling to myself a time when I personally had an encounter with a stingray, and I'm going to tell you about it. When I was in college back in the 90s, I went to school in northern Arizona, and it was very common for students to take spring breaks down in Puerto Peñasco, Mexico, also known as Rocky Point. Now, when you look at pictures of Rocky Point, Mexico today, it's all built up with all these beautiful resorts and all these wonderful hotels, and it's a very touristy place to be. Back in 1998, when I went, it was still very much a quiet and underdeveloped beachside town. In those days, you could actually drive up onto the beach and pop up a tent and just camp on the beach for however long you wanted with zero interruption. Aside from the walking vendors who would walk along the beach to these different campsites and try to sell their wares, some of them would try to sell food. We got some amazing breakfast burritos, and then some of them would just try to sell the most random items that you could possibly imagine. We ended up buying a generic Barbie on a parachute and attempting to float her in the beachside breeze. Mind you, this was after consuming quite a few adult beverages, which were very, very cheap in those days. So it was myself and a handful of friends. So I think we had about 3 or 4 tents popped up on the beach, and we had a different spring break than what a lot of the other Arizona universities had. Ours was a week before theirs. So we basically had the beach all to ourselves, which was amazing. It was so peaceful. We could just sit and chat and laugh and, of course, drink while we sat there on the beach and just enjoyed the beauty of the surroundings. There wasn't much out there. I believe there was a bar about maybe 300 yards up the beach from where we were, but aside from that, there wasn't very much unless you wanted to get off the beach and go into the town area. So the trip had already kind of started off a little bit rough for me. I had forgotten to bring my glasses with me. I was only wearing my contact lenses, and in the middle of the night, I lost one of my contact lenses in the tent and never to be found again. So I already was having difficulty seeing because I only had visibility in one eye. So on about the second day that we were there, we were planning to stay for the majority of the week. On the second day that we were there, we decided to go swimming. Now it was March, and one might imagine that the water would be beautiful. It's springtime, it's warm outside, but it was really quite breezy and chilly. If you've ever swam in the Pacific Ocean, you know that that water is freezing all the time. So we had put our feet in, and my friends, including my boyfriend at the time, had all decided that the water was far too cold to go swimming in. And of course, it's the ocean, so everyone is very hesitant to go into the water, not necessarily knowing what is out there. But I, being a very young person, and very new to my relationship, and also wanting to sort of show off in front of the people that we were with because I felt some of them were very important people. I decided that I was going to be the first to go into the water. So I walked in, and of course, it was freezing. When the water was about thigh level, I turned around backwards to begin taunting and coaxing my other friends to come into the water. I was telling them, oh, the water's not that bad. Look at me. I'm so brave. You guys are scared. Why don't you join me? Kind of taunting everybody else that was on the beach. Well, I, being a desert girly, was woefully underinformed about the way a person should conduct themselves as they are walking in the water. I have since learned that when you are at the beach, you should not step your feet. You should shuffle your feet. That way, any creatures that might be lurking on the bottom of the beach floor will know that you're coming and will skitter away. Because generally, creatures in the ocean are not aggressive, they just don't want to be bothered. I did not know this at the time. So as I was tromping my feet backwards, enticing my friends to come into the water, I stepped on something that felt quite squishy, and I was able to recognize for a split instant that I had stepped on something before something very hard stabbed me in the top of the foot. I had no idea what had just happened. I yelled out, "Something bit me!" and I began to sort of limp back into the shore. Now, of course, my friends, who were very far behind me and had not reached the depth that I was at, realized that there are dangerous things in the ocean, and they all turned around and ran back onto shore and left me to kind of limp my way back up onto the beach, where I sat and noticed a large puncture wound in the top of my foot. All of my friends are standing around me, kind of looking at me bleeding, saying, what happened? We were very confused. I thought perhaps I was pinched by a crab or something of that nature because, again, desert girly here didn't know what the heck I had encountered. So we sat there for a few minutes contemplating what it could possibly be, and then the pain started. I don't know how many of you out there have ever encountered a sea creature like a jellyfish or a stingray, but it's very difficult to describe the pain that comes from a stingray jab. It was burning, it was aching, it felt just horrible. And here I am on the beach with no resources and no methods of relief. Everyone began to fall back on the old idea that urine will decrease the sting of a jellyfish. So they began a rather panicked conversation amongst themselves about which one of them was going to pee on my foot, generally suggesting that one of the guys that was there would use his physical abilities to pee on me. And if you've ever seen that episode of Friends where Monica gets stung by the jellyfish and Joey and Chandler are debating and they're going back and forth about what the best solution is to decrease the pain of her jellyfish sting, that's pretty much what the conversation went like in my situation. They began to demand of my boyfriend that he pee on my foot, which I was staunchly against as it was an open wound, and I had decided that having someone else's urine inside my body was probably not the best option. So everyone determined that they were going to go back to our campsite, grab the car, and attempt to find some sort of lifeguard station. Because looking to the right, no lifeguard station. Looking to the left, absolutely no lifeguard station. Again, this is Mexico in the 90s, and what we might consider common safety protocols were not quite established in smaller cities in those days. So my friends decided they would go back to the campsite and they would gather up one of the cars and drive to where I was, and we would try to find a first aid station. I'm pausing here briefly to let you know why I'm playing with fire here. When you are making amigurumi, sometimes you really want to make sure that those safety eyes don't fall out. If you are able to melt the end a little bit and flatten it, it keeps those bottom grommets from popping off and ensuring that your safety eyes stay in place. This part is incredibly important if you plan on making stuffed animals to go to a toddler that might chew on those safety eyes and pop them out. On a side note, I would not recommend that if you are actually creating a stuffed item for a baby or a toddler. I would highly suggest using another piece of yarn to embroider the eyes on your stuffed animals. Now back to the story. So they loaded me up in the car and we drove down the dirt road that ran parallel to the beach looking for a lifeguard station. In the meantime, my brilliant boyfriend decided that he needed to use the restroom and there were no bathrooms to be found. So he jumped over the side of an embankment so that he could sort of do his business on the side of the road and landed his flip-flop covered feet on a bottle and slit his own foot open. You'll notice here that I've started using white as opposed to the aqua color that I was using. I'm now creating the underbelly of the stingray. We all know that stingrays have a camouflaging color on the top and a white underbelly. Once I'm done with this part, I will stitch it to the upper part before I give it some stuffing. So we made quite the pair, both bleeding from our feet and looking for a first aid station. We found a lifeguard station, but wouldn't you know it, there was no lifeguard in it. So we drove around a little bit longer trying to find some sort of medical attention, and we couldn't find any. So I was driven back to our campsite while I sat by the fire while they ran into the town to go to a pharmacy and try to find me some medical relief. They did end up finding a pharmacy. However, no one in the pharmacy spoke English. So after about 6 or 7 minutes of hand gestures and pantomimes, someone finally came in who was bilingual and could tell the pharmacist that I had been stung by a stingray, and the pharmacist gave them some topical lidocaine cream to help aid in my relief and sent them on their merry way. When they returned to where I was, I used the lidocaine really to no effect and decided that the tequila that they had purchased as a backup plan was probably my best option. So I nixed the lidocaine in favor of getting drunk on tequila, which worked for a little while. So we stayed in Puerto Penasco for another few days, and my boyfriend at the time and myself were quite the pair. I had lost the contact lens for my left eye, so I couldn't see out my left eye. I had been stabbed in the foot by a stingray on the right side, so I couldn't walk on my right side. He had split his foot open on the left side, so we were both kind of hobbling around with each other. They would frequently point out things in the ocean. Oh, look, it's a pod of dolphins. And I would really try with all my might to be able to see it. I wasn't able to see it because I was blind in one eye. So we stayed there for a while. We camped on the beach for another couple of days until it was time for Arizona State University to have their spring break. The beach began to fill up with people who had the same idea that we did about how they wanted to spend their spring break. We decided it was time for us to leave when a young college-going gentleman parked next to us with his toy hauler and his quads and three-wheelers and whatever, and got out of his RV wearing, I kid you not, one of those Viking helmets with the horns on it and shooting bottle rockets off of the beach. We decided that it was not our scene and it was time for us to go. So that concludes the exciting story of camping on the beach in Puerto Peñasco. However, on our way home, as was typical back in those days, we were stopped by a jeep full of federales. If you're not familiar with federales, they were like a sort of military police group, and they were entitled to pull you over, search your vehicle, and haul you off to a Mexican jail where you might sit for who knows how long until somebody was able to find the money to get you out of jail. So they stopped us and pulled us out of our vehicle while they searched it before we could get back across the border. So we're standing here next to this group of guys with these large machine guns as they're digging through our glove compartment and our trunk and all of our belongings, making sure that we're not taking some sort of illicit materials back across the border. Once they finally determined that we were of no threat, they let us back in our car and away we went. The story doesn't quite end there after we got across the border. When I got back into northern Arizona and I was back at school, it might have been another couple of days, but my foot then swole up to about the size of a football. I had to end up going to the medical clinic on campus, and fortunately there was a physician there who was familiar with stingray stings. They provided me with some antibiotics and some steroids, and I was able to get my foot back to its normal size once again. And thus ends this particular yarn about the time I spent in Mexico in the 90s when I was physically assaulted by a stingray. Thanks for joining me, and keep an eye out for the next installment of Spinning a Yarn with Idle Hands. See you next time.